Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another exciting episode of Utopias. Today, I'm really happy to be in conversation with Ana Kasparian. Ana is the host and producer and a journalist with the renowned online news network, progressive news network, the Young Turks. And Ana is someone I've known since back in 2011 when I first appeared on the Young Turks. And I appear with the Young Turks quite frequently to this day every month. It's really notable that Ana Kasparian is a journalist. This podcast is really focused on trying to tell the stories of and share insights from journalists who are really important at this time. Truth tellers, eyes and ears to the ground, trying to really investigate power and call out power. Ana Kasparian is one of the most interesting and dear friends of mine in the progressive world here in Los Angeles, where I'm based. And she's also been a columnist and a keynote speaker at universities around the country, was a Forbes 30 under 30 in 2016, and is someone who's been in direct, debates with people, for example, like Ben Shapiro and others. So this episode with Ana was recorded November 20th. So that's about 6 weeks after the October 7th attacks led by Hamas, brutal attacks on Israeli soil, and of course, the brutal response led by Israel and the IDF afterward. This recording was recorded November 20th, but it gives us a sense of where things were at this time that we can look at in terms of where things are today. Obviously, since the time of the Israeli attack on the Gaza Strip, we have seen an increase in popularity for a ceasefire by Americans and certainly people all around the world. A staggering, astonishing number of deaths, particularly women and children, and to some extent, a change in the Biden administration's policy and support of the current right-wing government of Israel. Ana and I, in this conversation, discuss where we're headed in terms of journalism, how her own story in terms of becoming a journalist, how technology and digital platforms are influencing journalism, including AI systems that might take away journalists' jobs themselves. And we also talk about, of course, the 2024 United States election, including some of the candidates at that time, like Vivek Ramaswamy, who's now very much a Trump acolyte and surrogate, RFK Jr., who's running as an independent, Ron DeSantis, and others. So please enjoy this conversation. Please feel free to share Utopias and this particular episode with anybody and everybody. Leave us a 5-star review. Remember, our podcast is all about telling stories of those who repair and care for our world, our country, and so on. And you'll see absolutely how Ana Kasparian is one of those people who really embodies such. Thank you all and enjoy the podcast. All right. So everybody, I'm so honored and grateful, and I really mean this from my heart, to welcome, I consider my friend and colleague, Ana Kasparian, who I consider one of the most important journalists, definitely in the country, if not in the world, someone who speaks truth to power and has such integrity in the way she approaches questions of politics, questions of the news, and questions of what it means to be American and let alone a citizen on the planet in the world today. So, Ana, I know we've actually known one another for over a decade, and I just wanted to tell you how much I appreciate every way in which I've had an opportunity to collaborate with you and receive your support.
Thank you. Ramesh, I thank you so much for this introduction. It feels undeserved, but I really appreciate it. It's very kind of you. And it's been an absolute pleasure getting to know you, working with you, and being a friend of yours.
I don't know if you remember this, Ana, but I first met you when you were running this sort of panel show that was sort of a Bill Maher type of project that the Young Turks put out called The Point.
I remember.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
Yeah. Super old show. It's like I think we wrapped it up in like 2014 or 2015. Yeah.
Yeah. That was a really amazing sort of, for me, experiment but by the Young Turks to try to support
discussions, including amongst those who may not always agree with one another. Because guess what? We're all human beings. We're all different in some ways. And also sort of expand the range of voices in conversation with one another,
Mhm.
as opposed to, I think, what is generally on the Bill Maher show at this point, which is sort of right wing to mainstream voices and rarely really progressive ones. But I've been a huge fan and supporter of the Young Turks. I have the honor of getting to join you all every now and then, doing long interviews, including with you and Cenk Uygur, and I guess I just want to start by asking you about a little bit about your own story, like where you grew up, being Armenian American, and how. And we've talked about this a little before, just like you and I. What got you into journalism? What inspired you to become a journalist and to get to the place where you are today?
So I grew up in a working class community in the San Fernando Valley. It's in Los Angeles County, but it's not considered like LA proper, even though it's in LA County. So the town I grew up in is Reseda, California. In fact, my parents still live in the same home and I visit them every Sunday. So, I still get to spend time in my childhood home, which is nice. But, I had a very interesting upbringing in that we were the only Armenian family at the time in that neighborhood. Even today, it mostly consists of Hispanic and Latin American working class individuals. They've had a tremendous impact on my life, how I see the world, and I'm so grateful for that. So I had the pleasure of growing up in a very diverse place and having the pleasure of enjoying all these different cultures around me, but it did feel a little isolating as the only Armenian in my elementary school. People didn't know what Armenia was. Talking about the Armenian genocide seemed strange to people. And it wasn't really until I was in college where I started to realize that more and more people in Los Angeles, at least due to the gigantic Armenian diaspora, were aware of the genocide, were aware of Armenian refugees, not just pouring into the United States, but into countries all around the world following the genocide of the First World War. But that kind of shaped, I think, that unresolved trauma of what happened to Armenians has kind of been passed down generation to generation and has had an impact on the way that I see the world around me, the way that I see injustices in other countries or other parts of the world. One of the greatest injustices that's happening right now as we speak is, the plight of the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip and the occupied West Bank. Since my parents basically gave up everything in their country to come here as refugees, they cared deeply about what I did with my life. They did this to give us a better life. So my mom was very much like having conversations with me even when I was super young and had no idea what I wanted to do as an adult. And when I told her at one point in middle school that I wanted to pursue a career as an actress, she just like shook her head. She's like, "No, you're not going to do that." And there was really my upbringing made it clear that I didn't really have a choice in that situation. If she says no, then that means no. They're not going to support that career path. And I'm really glad that she dissuaded me and discouraged me from pursuing acting because I don't think that would have been the right career for me. And so as we had more and more of those conversations, at one point in middle school, she brought up journalism because she noticed that every Friday night I would just get super excited about watching ABC's 2020, which at the time was hosted by Barbara Walters. I loved it. I was just obsessed with that show, obsessed with the interviews that she would do. And so she brings that up and says, "Why don't you pursue a career in journalism?" And as soon as she said it, something just clicked. And from that moment on, I wanted to pursue, a career, if not as a journalist, at least in the news media as a producer or something. And so I worked really hard and didn't give up. And it's due to my persistence, I ended up finding the right place for me, which is TYT, where I'm an executive producer and host.
So, were some of the journalists that you most admired and look up to were like Barbara Walters, and who are some of the others, both in the United States and around the world?
So it changes. When I was much younger and a little less aware of certain biases and corporate influence. I was definitely a fan of Barbara Walters, Diane Sawyer, Katie Couric, obviously a lot of women, because I saw myself in them, or at least I saw the possibility of growing into a career like theirs. But after the events of 9/11, the tragic terrorist attacks, and then everything that followed in regard to the dismantling of our civil liberties, the preemptive war in Iraq, I really started to question these mainstream voices because they were kind of in lockstep with the powerful. And when I went to journalism school, the education that I received made it clear that the whole point of journalism is to challenge authority. What I saw happening, after 9/11 was just endless numbers of reporters acting as stenographers and simply regurgitating what authority figures in the government were saying. And that led us to a preemptive war in Iraq, where we did not find weapons of mass destruction at all, and caused all sorts of mayhem and bloodshed toward the Iraqi people. So at that point, I started reading the work of people like Matt Taibbi, Glenn Greenwald. And, since then, they've kind of gone in some directions that I don't agree with, but I still value the journalism that they provided at that time. And ultimately, I've come to the conclusion that there really are no heroes. I think it would be a mistake to take any one journalist or any group of journalists and put them on some sort of pedestal as the arbiters of what fair, hard-hitting journalism is. Everyone has their flaws. I've come to realize that I have my own flaws, and I've done some reporting in the past that I deeply regret because I wasn't fully informed of all sides. And I think just having that awareness makes you better at your job and better at ensuring that you're informing the public to the best of your ability without falling prey to certain corporate narratives or partisan narratives that tend to play out in the media more and more, as honestly partisanship becomes a mainstay in the way news gets reported.
Yeah, without doubt. And also, I think one thing that's powerful in your story is something that I think all of us Americans and people around the world who live in countries that are countries of immigrants can take note of, which is what makes this country amazing in many ways, despite all of the terrible problems associated with our own hypocrisy and being of empire, quite honestly, is the layers and layers of immigrants that have come through this country, and sort of the values and discipline that our parents held out to us. I mean, I have a very similar story in my sense. I wanted to study art and philosophy, which now I, of course, dabble in. When I was an undergraduate, and my parents were like, doctor, engineer, or business. I was like, well, I'm not going to to be like a Goldman Sachs person. I already knew that at that time, thanks to being into music and being a DJ and stuff at that time. That opened my consciousness. But I was like, I don't know if I want to be a physician because that's a very difficult lifestyle. So I was like, okay, engineer, why not? And now, of course, we're all so much more than merely that, right? So thanks to our parents and all the immigrants that have brought for centuries a certain sense of vitality to this country. So I'm curious, now as we look at journalism, right? And that's sort of something that's really part of this country, but also connected to what occurred when sort of public sphere journalism got more and more eroded, has long been the corporatization of journalism, right? Which I think you were just alluding to. So we've known for decades, and we're not even talking about right now, the kind of strange paths that people like Glenn Greenwald and others have taken, Matt Taibbi and so on, in my mind. But even for decades, journalists, because of the nature of working for-profit corporations, have often had pressure upon them to sort of decide what stories to promote and what stories not to promote, and how to frame the news events and even their analysis of it. And we're sitting through that right now, which is unendingly frustrating. We're witnessing the slaughter of thousands upon thousands of Palestinian peoples after the slaughter of Jewish brothers and sisters, but to a whole other level, a very asymmetric level, no doubt. And journalists are not really, not in a very significant way, deviating from the narrative of the United States military and the United States empire, I would say.
And the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, and the Israeli government. I do want to say one thing about that before you ask your question.
Sure.
And I don't mean to interrupt you, but I think this is important.
No.
You know, I've been doing this work for 17 plus years at this point, and the conflict, the war between the Israeli government and the Palestinian people has been ongoing this entire time. I mean, it's obviously been going on a lot longer than my career. But what was fascinating to me this time around was that for a brief moment, for a few weeks at least, following Israel's retaliatory efforts in Gaza, even corporate media couldn't deny the footage and the images that were coming out of Gaza. And you had someone like Jake Tapper on CNN, who himself is Jewish, who himself is very sympathetic to the Israeli government and had a history of basically providing apologia for the criminal, war acts committed by the Israeli government. All of a sudden, you see him looking at the civilian death toll in Gaza and he was asking tough questions of his guests. He was doing incredible reporting. I was actually really, really proud to see it. But then he takes a trip to Israel, as many of the corporate media anchors did at the time. They watch a 45-minute propaganda video put together by the Israeli government, which shows the atrocities and terrorist acts committed by Hamas. And it was amazing how much the reporting changed after that. And suddenly the excuses for what Israel is doing, the excuses and cover for the war crimes that the Israeli government and the IDF is committing started getting reported, right? Basically, let's go right back to where we started in pretending as though this asymmetrical, lopsided war isn't actually taking place, that all of the atrocities are committed by the Palestinians against, the Israelis. It was really sad to see things kind of snap back to where they had been. But what's also different this time around is that the media landscape has really been flooded with so many different independent voices who are not in any way associated with the traditional legacy media outlets like the CNNs or the New York Times or the Washington Post or the MSNBCs, NBCs, CBSs. You have sources that are now reporting on their own, like let's say at platforms like Substack. And you can't basically shield the American audience and readership from the reality on the ground in Gaza anymore. And that's really important to note. And I think that's an incredibly important development that I hope continues to expand, because it is changing the hearts and minds of American voters, the vast majority of whom want a ceasefire in Gaza. I would have never thought that this day would come. And I'm really happy to say that, again, the hearts and minds of Americans are changing, and I think for good reason.
It's such an important point, Anna. And I actually had noticed that Jake Tapper and a couple other mainstream media journalists were like, wait a second, this is not okay. Wait a second, this reminds us of what happened after 9/11 and with the Iraq war and so on. This is sort of uncanny, and this is not okay. But at the same time, again, in Tapper's case, and we've seen with many mainstream media journalists, them continuing to toe the line and kind of parrot the IDF/US State Department /US corporate machine sort of signaling. And so I wanted to tie that to what you just said, which is now there's an opportunity, and we see right now many other voices sort of getting out there and getting to Americans and getting to people around the world. And I guess I wanted to ask, for journalists, how are they able to survive? And I partly mean that financially, but I also partly mean that in terms of being like shut down or canceled or fear being put into their lives, because we know there's a lot of trolling and worse. How are you all able to pull this off?
Well, it's not easy. It's incredibly difficult. And so, every morning we begin our production meeting with just this mountain of potential topics that we're going to cover on the show.
Yeah.
And we have to parse out what we absolutely must cover, knowing full well that some of those stories aren't going to draw the numbers and the revenue necessary to basically stay afloat. And so as a result of that, we find ourselves having to balance the stories that we care about, the stories that, give the network and the main show, which I'm the executive producer of, the gravitas and the loyal audience that we have. We have to balance that out with, I wouldn't say stories we don't care about, but I would say stories that tend to be a little more controversial in nature. There's some sort of drama or conflict involved, usually stories involving infighting within the Republican Party. Stuff like that tends to do really well. And that's not to say that those stories aren't important at all. But when you compare, catfights within the GOP to the weight of what's happening in Gaza, or what's happening with, for instance, the huge lobbying effort right now to re-implement the standards that allow for businesses to charge Americans junk fees, right? Like, that's a dense story. Like, that's not going to draw in a giant number of viewers. Yeah. But we got to cover those stories for the audience that does exist, that does care, that wants to know about that stuff, because it's not going to be reported really anywhere else. There might be a few other sources, but it's so important for Americans to get information that helps them understand the world around them, why their economic situation feels and is as unstable as it is. These are hard-hitting stories that I think were a mainstay in American journalism back when we had something known as the Fairness Doctrine. And the Fairness Doctrine ensured that the news media was operating in a way that served the public interest and actually covered all sides fairly. Since the dismantling of the Fairness Doctrine, though, you see certain characters and figures like Rush Limbaugh pop up and replace what traditional news media was. And I think that was to the detriment of the American people. And I think that has led to what we're experiencing today, where Americans don't have trust in our institutions, and that includes news institutions. And so they fall prey, unfortunately, in some cases, to nefarious figures pushing out all sorts of weird conspiracy theories. In reality, everything that they're experiencing doesn't need to be explained by a conspiracy theory. It's actually very easy to explain what's happening to Americans right now. It's just that they're not getting that accurate information to them from the legacy media outlets that Americans used to rely on for accurate reporting.
And a lot of this is about the privatization of what should be in the commons or part of the public, and private corporate power and extraction that's all about profit or valuation taking over and transgressing on the demos, right, which is the power of voices, of all of our voices, right? And so when as an independent journalist, and specifically in the context of the Young Turks, you all, I know how much, like personally, you have a commitment to democratic accountability, being like a check to power, and doing that kind of public interest, supporting the public interest. So how do you sort of deal with the economics associated with being an independent media outlet? Because I recall at times, the Young Turks was part of Current TV, which then was part of the Al Jazeera America takeover. Everyone remember that? Maybe not.
Right.
Sitting here or seeing this. And then I remember also briefly, it was part of MSNBC. So at the Young Turks, how do you all do this? How do you keep afloat economically? And the other thing I want to say related to it is, having been a friend of all of yours for over a decade, I feel the Young Turks is very much a community. I was just hanging out with JR when I was in the studio. He's just the best, and John, I saw John, and I always feel this sense of community whenever I'm with all of you.
Oh, that's so nice. Yeah. Well, it's man, mentioning Current TV. So Current TV was where the Young Turks ended up. There was a television version of our show on Current TV, but that television version ended after Current TV was bought out by Al Jazeera. Cenk decided against, transitioning over to Al Jazeera for whatever reason. I think it was the right decision, to be quite frank, because we were also simultaneously doing the online version of the show, and doing both versions every day was difficult, emotionally and mentally taxing. And so I was really happy to hear that we were going to just go right back to focusing on our online show, which had a much larger audience and I think gave us a lot more freedom. You know, there was less format issues involved. We could do long form segments if we needed to really dive deeper into certain topics. Prior to that, though, the reason why we ended up on Current TV was because there was a campaign to get Cenk Uygur on MSNBC. And sure enough, he did end up on MSNBC. But the problem was, at this time, it was the Obama administration in power. And Cenk was critical, highly critical of the Obama administration for a litany of reasons, one of which had to do with his foreign policy, which really was an expansion, a continuation and expansion of Bush era foreign policies, which we were vehemently against and very critical of. And so Cenk was told by the head of MSNBC at the time that he needed to get in line and, you know, stop being so critical toward the Obama administration. They had offered him a pretty lucrative contract to do a weekend show. And the understanding was that he would tone down the rhetoric and the critique of the Obama administration. Cenk decided, no, I'm not going to take this deal. I'm not going to be censored or silenced. And so he gave up a $1 million contract in order to be able to speak freely about, you know, how he actually felt and what he was actually seeing in terms of the Obama administration's failures, both economically toward the American people and foreign policy wise, as it pertained to his policies in, you know, the Middle East at the time. And I just had so much admiration for him for doing that. It takes a very strong person to turn down that kind of money. I myself have gotten offers at other networks to make far more than I'm making now, but I just turn them down because I know what it's going to be like working in these environments. I know that journalists aren't really free to report without their editors coming in and basically taking charge of the narrative to ensure that they're in lockstep with the outlets and, you know, their overall reporting on various issues, be it the economy, the political establishment, or foreign policy. So that was when Current TV, which was founded by Al Gore, decided to give TYT a shot. And that's how we ended up there. But since the purchase of Current TV by Al Jazeera, we've mostly just done online work. We're on live linear programming as well. We're in a bunch of different platforms. And I give the business side of TYT a lot of credit for diversifying the business model, which really has helped keep us afloat. Since we air on so many different platforms, if one platform, for whatever reason, has made some changes, maybe algorithmic changes, it won't affect us to the point where we're no longer able to stay afloat. At the same time, on the production side, we've really had to balance content that we know is going to do poorly just because of the dense material that we're covering or the subject matter we're covering. We have to balance that with stuff that we know is going to perform well revenue-wise in order to stay afloat. But I think that we've struck a pretty good balance. And it's a frustrating puzzle every single day. And sometimes I'm very frustrated by it. I was frustrated today. You know, we're going to have a Thanksgiving break, but we need to generate revenue during the Thanksgiving break. So we have to like meticulously plan for content that will be released while we're on break. And, you know, it's always a race. It's always super stressful. I constantly feel like I'm being squeezed by like the revenue responsibilities, but you have to worry about those things because if you don't have a news business that can stay afloat, you're unable to cover these stories the way that TYT has been covering them.
Yeah, and part of it is the integrity that you all have when you do appear on mainstream media or corporate media. You know, I've seen over the years, being like a friend of yours or all of yours, you know, I'll see Cenk. I just saw Cenk on Piers Morgan. I was telling him about it the other day. Whew. And then
Crazy.
and I've seen you, you know, join CNN many times. I've seen you in dialogue with folks like Ben Shapiro. I saw Cenk in dialogue with someone like Tucker Carlson, and you all maintain integrity in around your views. You're able to be really consistent with what you believe in and what the values you stand for. It feels to me partly because you actually walk the walk with your network itself, which, you know, I want everybody to hear, to note this. The Young Turks is the most widely, please correct me if I don't get this exactly correct, the most watched online news show in the entire world. Did I get that right?
I think so. Cenk is gonna be very upset with me. I should be better about knowing our numbers, and I'm very bad at self-promotion. So the
I'll
thing that
take
I
that.
hate about the show is live reads, and I think it's obvious that I hate live reads when I
Yeah.
have to like advertise something. I can't stand it. But yeah, I think we do have a giant audience. We have a giant loyal audience.
Yeah.
And I think what they respect is that, at least with the main show, I can confidently say that we are willing to give them a side of the story that they don't necessarily want to hear, that might even offend their sensibilities, right? But I've kind of grown to realize that it would be a mistake to just surround yourself with an echo chamber of like-minded individuals who believe like-minded things. I know that during the Black Lives Matter protests, during the coronavirus pandemic, I was definitely surrounding myself with too many people who just agreed with everything I believed. And that shut my perspective down to other things that were happening in the country, other realities, areas, quite honestly, where the right wing even had a point. And I think that it would be a mistake to think like, oh, the left is always right and the right is always wrong. That's just not true. And I think the stories that I made mistakes in during that period of time makes that abundantly clear. The fact that I had a completely different perspective on what actually occurred in the Kyle Rittenhouse case, then you look at the video of what actually occurred on the ground, and it was so different from the way the story was initially reported. And so that was a big wake up call for me. And I had to correct my errors. Some portion of the audience hated that and maybe stopped watching like completely after I made those corrections. But to me, showing that I'm willing to make those corrections, showing that I have, enough humility to admit when I'm wrong, helps to build an audience that at least trusts me and knows that even if it's going to be embarrassing for me to admit these flaws and these mistakes, at least I'm being honest with them. And that's the kind of audience that I want to foster.
Oh, Anna, you're super real in a way that almost no other journalist I've ever encountered is, right? You show your vulnerability and your subjectivity. And I think that's what makes you quite special and
Thank
unique,
you.
actually. And not and almost no journalist I know does that, right? In many ways, they are sort of talking heads that represent particular framings on issues. And one other thing I just want to point out to everybody who's listening and watching this is the Young Turks are very globally known as well. You probably have many stories like this, like a friend of mine who is an iconic punk rock drummer that I know who lives in 50 miles outside of Brussels, who met me in the train station in Brussels last year, was like, "Have you heard of the Young Turks, Ramesh? Like, I watch them all the time." I was like, "Oh, they're actually like friends of mine, and I'm on there sometimes." And he was like, "What?" Or I was just in India. I know this is my
Mhm.
crazy life, like literally a week ago, and I was in a suburb of Bangalore, South India, and this like engineer guy who's a friend of mine was like, "Oh yeah, Ramesh, you were on the Young Turks the other day." I was like, "Whoa, you're watching the Young Turks." So this is also something that some of friends of mine who are independent musicians and artists tell me, that yes, there is always the importance of staying financially afloat, especially in a nation or in a world where the public journalism is not appropriately supported, and much of our public journalism in the United States is how do I say that, a bit, I don't want to be too graphic with it, but it's sort of like the guts are cut out of a lot of it. Let's put it that
Mhm.
way. um,
Yeah.
Probably that's that reward of really reaching people all over the place, and that reward of like supporting a global community.
Yeah, definitely. I remember several years ago, this is like before TYT was even as big as it is today. Cenk and I went to Portugal for something called the Web Summit.
That's where
And
I just was 3 days ago.
oh, nice, nice. Yeah. And I was like shocked to see how many times I got recognized in Portugal. I just didn't really expect to have many audience members there. But it was really nice to experience that and to talk to people who feel that shows like ours gives them a voice. And I've been getting a lot of those types of comments from Arabs across the globe, obviously Palestinians who feel that their voices have not been heard and have not been represented accurately in American media. And so I take a lot of pride in that. And to me, that's what makes what I do worth it, which is why if I had to choose, and I've been given this proposition, I've been given this opportunity to choose between making a lot more money, but being censored, or making less money, far less money at TYT, but having the freedom, the editorial freedom to cover the stories that I want to cover and talk about these stories from the perspectives that I think are important. Like, that is so incredibly valuable to me. And I think most people in the world want to feel that the work that they do serves a purpose. And they'll even turn away lucrative contracts, lucrative salaries in order to pursue work that actually serves a purpose. Nothing makes me feel more shame than knowing that I have this opportunity and I didn't get stories right. And so I beat myself up a lot about that issue. And I do my best. Everyone's going to make mistakes, so I don't want to pretend as though I'm going to be perfect moving forward. But I have this incredible opportunity, and I don't want to ever squander it by falling prey to any echo chamber that really seeks to serve one side of a story as opposed to representing the reality of what the story is.
Absolutely. And you know what I wanted to ask you about next, which you alluded to really briefly before, is sort of the promise and the pitfalls of journalism now being increased, pretty much almost completely remediated or kind of shape shifted by the internet and by digital platforms, right? So on the one hand, like being an online show means you require having to be online, and that allows you to create your own network. I mean, all of you, and reach audiences that way without having to go through corporate media gatekeeping, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Which is, what is required, whether it's even in print media, like in the past, at least with New York Times, even, or the Washington Post, which has great journalists but is owned by Jeff Bezos, right? It's like, and don't get me wrong, like, that doesn't mean that all the journalists are corrupted by Bezos, but it does mean that there's a political economy shaping all of it. So the internet, in a sense, and we all remember this, 15 years ago, everyone was like, oh yeah, it's the internet. It's like, they used to use the term Web 2.0. Everybody's voice is part of this internet. Citizen journalism, that was a term we heard a lot, also in relation to current TV and Al Gore's creation of it. And then we saw, as we all know, that the internet is also redirecting content because of corporate big technology platforms that tend to optimize inflammatory, outrageous, hateful, and sometimes just deliberately false content, much of which has supported the rise of extremists in the United States and terrorist actions, I would say, like January 6th, even in a sense is directly tied to the rise of neo-fascists like the former president, Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we also saw the internet being like $18, everyone give $18 to support the Bernie Sanders campaign, which I worked on, full disclosure. So we see this internet kind of, and the corporate technology platforms that drive the internet redirecting and actually, in a certain sense, blurring and manipulating and bordering what could be a real public sphere. Yet at the same time, without the internet, how can the Young Turks be what it is? So I guess I want to speak to you about where you think we're at when it comes to all of these things. And then I want to ask you about labor issues and the future of journalism.
Yeah, well, I think that you're hitting on a very real problem, but I think it would be a mistake to think that it's simply these various platforms and their algorithms that is pushing people to extreme ideas or extreme programming, because you really need the public to completely lose faith and trust in traditional legacy outlets for them to consider some of the more extreme outlets that, we can talk about. The Alex Jones of the world, I think, is a good example. And so I'll give you an example. You mentioned what happened on January 6th. And obviously that was a horrible day in America. Watching that footage broke my heart. But at the same time, what I think is missing, and this is a perspective that I didn't have until fairly recently, what was missing was the way that a critique. What was missing was a critique of the way the media covered that rioting versus the way the media covered riots that took place during the Black Lives Matter protests in the summer of 2020. So look, the legitimate protests should not be undermined by the reality that there were definitely bad actors exploiting those legitimate protests in order to engage in horrible rioting that victimized local communities, destroyed mom and pop businesses. The way that I felt prey to this too. I totally believe the mainstream media, narrative on that, which totally downplayed all of the riots that took place. And so you have all these people living in all these local communities who have lost everything because of the fires that were set, the businesses that were looted, everything's a mess. They're not getting any accurate coverage or representation in legacy media. And so what do you think that communicated to Trump supporters who were considering rioting in the Capitol on January 6th? Well, if those guys are allowed to riot, why can't we riot? And you can see the difference, the double standard in coverage there. And I think that it's really important to point that out, because what I think that ends up doing is it ends up driving audiences and readers to the extremes, because they no longer trust traditional forms of media. They no longer trust the legacy media outlets. So I think that we need to take some accountability in that area. At the same time, I do think that there is something to be said about how these various platforms want to increase engagement. They want people to spend more and more time on their platforms, consuming the content on these platforms. And the way to do that, the way to keep people engaged, is to focus on the outrageous, focus on the extremes. And I don't know what you can do to mitigate that. I don't know if there's ever going to be any type of policy that can mitigate that. What I do know, though, is that it's important to take a sober look at the American political landscape and actually engage in a good faith effort to understand why people are feeling the way they're feeling and why they're carrying out the acts that they're carrying out.
I couldn't agree more, and actually to understand where the anger and where the feeling of alienation and being disaffected, where that came from, also in relation to January 6th, and those who decided to assemble that day, which they had a right to do, and rather than this sort of thumbing the nose, looking down, patronizing people, whether it was Black Lives Matter protesters or January 6th protesters, right? I mean, there's a certain kind of, we govern you, we know better than you. We are, and this kind of smug elitism has created a lot of populist disaffection. Like, people are disaffected by all of these things. And so that's a whole other way of looking at where we are in the United States, right? There are these elites, and then there's the rest of us, right? And it's interesting to see that at a time where some of the most vocal voices for a ceasefire in Gaza and the most visible ones are folks like Tucker Carlson and now Candace Owens kind of voicing some support for this.
Yeah. It's insane. I just watched a lengthy interview. I can't believe I'm even saying this, that Candace Owens did with Norm Finkelstein.
I saw that too. Yeah.
And
good.
It was a really good interview. And she didn't interrupt him. She gave him space to speak. She asked good questions. I can't believe I'm saying these things, but I don't know if there was this maturation and growth in Candace Owens that I just missed because I didn't really take her seriously, considering her history and the things that she said in the past. But I will give credit where credit is due. And in regard to this one issue where she's willing to go against the grain of what conservatives tend to say and do, I got to give her credit. I do. Offering a platform to Norm Finkelstein on the Daily Wire is pretty huge. It really is.
Yeah. As we look at how to protect journalists and how important journalists are as witnesses to what's actually going on, as voices to help us all have a greater sense of reality around us, and all of us to have a sense of what we can do, it's actually really education and public literacy at its core that journalists provide to us. I want to ask you about where we are heading with, the viability of journalists being able to afford to continue to be journalists when we see artificial intelligence systems now being deployed. My PhD student is literally writing his dissertation on what we call generative AI, like ChatGPT and so on, and its impacts on the labor industry of journalists.
Mm-hmm.
This Zoom call, sad to say, that we're doing right now, Zoom has admitted it, of course, in very opaque terms of service that nobody can understand or read, but luckily journalists have written about it, is using our own data, our voice data, our physiognomic data, our visual data, to create potentially, an Ana Kasparian avatar that can be sort of deployed writ large. So all of this is obviously uncompensated, just like our data is uncompensated. All of it leverages, as we've spoken about on the Young Turks, and internet and digital technologies that started and required U.S. taxpayer investments.
Of course.
Yep, it's the privatization of public life on every level, right? Like these roads right outside me, there are Amazon Prime vehicles combing these roads. They have cameras all around them to grab demographic data. They also have cameras inside them to monitor biometric data from drivers. And they're serving a company that didn't pay taxes, whose founder and CEO doesn't pay taxes, yet they are using our public utilities or public investments into roads or the internet itself, which is sort of like the roads online, right? The infrastructures. And now these platforms are connected to the firing of journalists and a world more and more where artificially intelligent entities might be doing the journalism for us all done by private corporations. I'm just wondering what you think of that. I know that sounds a little bit like Black Mirror dystopia, but we're heading in that direction, and I'm concerned about it.
You should be. You absolutely should be concerned about it. And I don't think it sounds like a Black Mirror dystopia, as if it's just like some made up, like you're being some neurotic person panicking about nothing. Look, this is real. This is reality. And what I would say about it is corporate America, and that includes big tech, is going to do what they're going to do. The question is, do we have a political class and representation in DC that actually A, understands what's happening? Are they cognizant of it? And B, are they willing to do what's necessary to regulate and rein in industries that seek to exploit in any way necessary to maximize their profits? And the fact of the matter is, we have, in the Democratic Party at least, an aging population of politicians who are so deeply concerned about trading their individual stocks, maximizing their own profits, having a vested interest in the financial success of these corporations. They don't care about us because the system that we're being governed by incentivizes them to not give a damn about us. It incentivizes the absolute worst people to run for government, for public office, for these congressional seats, not to actually represent the constituents they're purporting to want to represent. No. But rather to enrich themselves through campaign donations, and more importantly, through trading individual stocks. That conflict of interest is inherent. It is baked into the system. And so I'm not going to begrudge corporations for doing what corporations are supposed to do. They are machines that seek to maximize profits, period. That is what they do. We are supposed to have a political system that is supposed to shield the American people from the excesses, from the exploitative practices of these corporations. But they're not doing that because they have the exact same interests as the very corporations that they're supposed to be reining in. That is the problem here. We do not have a political class that is representing us. That is the biggest problem here. And that is also leading to what we're seeing in people kind of fleeing to the extremes in our political spectrum. They don't trust our politicians. They don't trust our institutions. And who can blame them? Who can blame them? So when we talk about extremism in America, I think it would be a mistake to just pin it on one figure, which is what the media has been doing. They've been pinning it on Donald Trump. And to be sure, Donald Trump is a mercurial person who says incredibly hateful, irresponsible things. That type of rhetoric has unfortunately permeated and seeped into the American consciousness. And it has given people from the dark corners of society permission to spew their vile garbage day in and day out. But it is a mistake, if you ask me, to assume that this all started with Donald Trump, that this is all Donald Trump's fault. No, our institutions have failed us. And we have been calling for deep reforms, robust reforms for quite some time now. And everything is just operating as if it's fine. We don't need reforms. And instead of taking accountability and responsibility for the failures in these institutions, the figures within them are seeking to provide cover for themselves while pinning the blame on others. And I'm just sick of it. And I think it's time to be frank about what's actually going on.
In a way, you could see sort of every major political leader, at least in the United States, as a product of a set of forces that kind of conjured him or her up, right? And in a sense, this certain sense of alienation, disaffection, appropriate lack of trust in these sort of smug institutions that themselves and you know, Cenk and you, I know Cenk very directly says this is corruption.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, the corruption of these institutions, and then also these forces, the technological ones we discussed, which the ability for the former president to signal and put out content that is able to go highly viral and rile everybody up, and is also a great thing in a certain dystopic sense for mainstream media, who are constantly covering anything and everything he does, and will continue to do that as we head toward this next election, which I want to speak to you about. You know, in a sense, you can see him as a product of these times, right? And both technologically as well as politically, as well as in terms of this kind of corrupt political economy. Of course, I want to ask you about where you feel, you know, we as progressives are. And I guess I want to say this in a way which is sort of not about fragmentation, right? Like, so when I call myself a progressive, I do like happily. For me, that doesn't mean I'm not a brother or sister or like up to someone who has very different political views than me. I guess what I'm concerned about is that we've all gotten increasingly camped, and I've never seen myself that way ever. I don't feel like you're at all like that either. Like, you'll talk with anybody. You want to hear from all voices. Yet it seems somehow that things have gotten fragmented in the media, including on the online media. But increasingly, there's like niches. Okay, if I want to go progressive, I look at these networks. If I want to go right populist, I can go to these networks. And in a sense, that perhaps is taking away from the kind of critical need in a democracy for us all to talk with one another, and maybe to do that in a way that's a little more slowed down and respectful with one another. But it seems like all of that is at tension with the ways in which branding has to occur and the ways these economies have to occur, which put out viral inflammatory content.
I think you make such a good point about how the current business model in media does encourage a more partisan lens in coverage, right? So a lot of the branding, even TYT, I mean, home of the progressives, has been our branding over the last several years, since at least 2016. And I actually would like to, it's not up to me. Let me just be clear about that, right? I'm the executive producer of one show on the network, the main show, and the host of that show, but it's an entire network and it's not really up to me to make decisions about branding. However, if I had a say in any of it, I would want to move away from that branding. And the reason why I say it is not because I no longer agree with progressive politics, but I would say that when you have that kind of branding, there's this pressure to live up to that branding. And the pressure to live up to that branding, I think, I'm only going to speak to myself, has blinded me to varying perspectives that I think should be represented, and in some cases make good points about various, big issues facing the country today. And so lately there have been like increased allegations that I'm like a closet Republican, which I'm not. But there are some policy areas and some policies that were implemented by progressives in big cities that I think have been failures. And I think we need to be real about that. I think that if we're going to purport to want to make people's lives better, we can't then turn a blind eye to policies we've implemented that have actually made people's lives worse. So I'm going to always be honest about those issues. And I've been increasingly honest about those issues on the show. And since I'm really maybe the only progressive calling out these flaws in policy, it's jarring to audience members who think, oh, she's questioning these things because she's actually a grifter, or which is hilarious because I've been at TYT for 17 plus years. I'm not going anywhere else. Nothing's changed about my pay. I don't have any other deals or anything like that. No, I'm just telling you what you don't want to hear. And you could just decide you don't want to hear it and turn it off, but don't go around accusing me of being a grifter. Actually engage in the arguments I'm making. And if there are flaws in the arguments, I'm all ears. I'm ready to hear it, right? But I think it is a mistake, again, I'm going to say it, to surround yourself with like-minded people who agree with you on everything, because you are purposely shielding yourself from perspectives and realities that would give you a much better, well-rounded view of what's actually happening in the country and in the world.
And so what are, just to ask directly, like what are some of those policies that you feel like have been pushed through by so-called progressives that have done us a disservice?
So I can, since I have so much experience with it as a Californian, I can talk about what's been going on in California. So various communities, typically communities that are majority minority communities, Black and brown people living in these parts of town, they have been victimized by some of the criminal justice reform policies that have been rammed through, right? And when I say rammed through, I mean both by the state legislature and also through ballot initiatives. So when we were pursuing criminal justice reform, I want to be clear about what we wanted, okay? We wanted better police training, so reforms within policing, not the abolishing of police, not the abolishment of prisons. California has decided to shut down 2 of its prisons, which has made county prisons overcrowded, which has essentially pressured correctional officers and the administrators running those prisons to release, in a lot of cases, violent offenders way too early. You have bail reform, which has been used so generously that you'll have individuals who have committed 40 plus crimes, many of which are violent crimes, getting booked and then getting released immediately after that. Californians were lied to through a proposition called Prop 47, which made it appear as though our criminal justice system was going to be reformed so non-violent offenders would have options other than time behind bars to, reform themselves, to rehabilitate themselves. And when I voted yes on that measure, I was under the impression that this had to do with people who got caught with drugs, people who are nonviolent, people who really shouldn't be behind bars. I didn't realize that the state was then going to reclassify all sorts of violent felonies as misdemeanors. And that includes domestic violence, like strangulation. That is considered a misdemeanor in California. They reclassified child sex trafficking as a misdemeanor. And the state legislature basically had several votes to classify it as a felony again. Finally, they did it. But it took several years to reclassify child sex trafficking as a crime deserving of prison time, deserving of a felony charge. And you also have to keep in mind that the way our criminal justice system works, oftentimes prosecutors will have the defendant plead out. And so if a violent crime is reclassified as a misdemeanor, and then they're able to take a plea deal on that misdemeanor, they're probably not going to serve any time behind bars for something that used to be considered a serious felony, a violent crime. And you look at what's happening with these smash and grabs, the organized crimes that engage in these smash and grabs. You have stores shutting down all across the country, but mostly in communities that were already down to one grocery store, for instance. So we're turning various, vulnerable communities into food deserts. And so I just fail to understand how these policies make people's lives better. If you read the polling and you listen to the African American communities living in these cities, they want change and they don't like these policies. But you have a lot of privileged white people living in gated communities calling the shots and pretending as though the reality on the ground is not the reality on the ground, and it's a lie. And it makes me really angry to see it. And I don't want to associate with that, because I want to live in a fact-based society that actually seeks to make people's lives better, not worse.
It's so powerfully said, and it is yet another example, Anna, of the sort of division is more between elites who are paternalistic and patronizing, and kind of think of others as sort of like almost their subjects in a sense. That's why I feel, again, journalism is all about listening to and amplifying the voices of all peoples, especially those who are on the ground, who are most affected by particular decisions or policies or events. This whole like caricature of all of us who stand up for civil rights, for social justice, for the working class, who want really truth tellers to be what journalism is all about, want an independent media. We're all getting caricatured as woke. This whole thing that my South Indian brother from another mother, Vivek Ramaswamy, who drives me insane, perhaps because it's like he's South Indian, I don't know. He's like, I wrote the book Woke Inc. And people like Jordan Peterson, who basically profited off of this kind of exclusionary objectification of many of us who also were part of the Sanders campaign, etc. Right? So it's a construction and an attempt to objectify many, many people, many of us who have quite different views, actually, in many cases from one another, but actually share a common set of values that believe in real democracy, that believe in trying to fight back against the incredibly economically unfair system within which all we are living in this country. Unbelievable. 3 people with equivalent wealth to 160 plus million people in this country. And I guess I want to ask about that, how in a way, perhaps some of us took that bait, spiraled out in these woke circles and started canceling and yelling at one another. But for me, so much of this is a construction and a manipulation, an ideological manipulation of those with power. Again, to me, it's about elite and the rest of us. But that's my 2 cents, my take on it. And I want to know, I want your thoughts on how we can get out of those snake pits that I feel those were putting us in, which I think, again, are reconstructed and re-architected and amplified by algorithmic systems, of course.
Well, I mean, I think that the quote unquote woke perspective is carried out by the elite on the left. And when I say left, I'm not talking about leftists. I'm just talking about, broadly speaking, those who identify as on the left, liberals, whatever it is. They tend to spend a lot more time engaging in language policing, browbeating, scolding, and all sorts of unempathetic behavior that is more intent on placing themselves on some sort of moral pedestal while looking down at others as unsophisticated, as hateful, even if what they're engaging in might not actually come from a place of hate, might come from a place of not being informed, or, Americans are barely making ends meet. So many Americans are working multiple jobs to make ends meet. Housing is unbelievably unaffordable and unattainable. They don't have time to sit around and check what the appropriate, acceptable rhetoric or language is when you're referring to an issue or a group of people. And when I say that, I'm mostly referring to the language changes that I don't even know how it starts. I don't even know who the deciders are. But, the Latinx thing is a good example of what I'm talking about. The Latino community doesn't like it. They didn't ask for it. And polling indicates that they hate it. But for several years, even to today, you'll have some, Democratic politicians insist on using Latinx and insist on others using Latinx because they're concerned about using gendered language and offending others. Okay, how about we actually have a conversation about improving our healthcare system so our transgendered brothers and sisters get the medical care that they need? I would venture to say that that's far more effective in improving people's lives than constantly obsessing over browbeating others for not using the, in your mind, appropriate terminology. And so I think that these issues provide fodder for the bad actors on the right who want to make their entire political campaigns on, anti-wokeism. But I don't think anti-wokeism is even enough to persuade American voters to back them, because that's really what Ron DeSantis decided to lean into for his presidential campaign, and it hasn't worked out well for him.
Not at all, because he comes across as so disingenuous. And there are these grifters on, well, maybe that wasn't nice, kind of me to say, unempathetic. So there are these folks who I have skepticism around, who are like claim to be intellectuals, who are kind of perpetuating this sort of on the right wing, this kind of, everybody from Peterson to John McWhorter to others. And it honestly drives me crazy. And when I see them on the Bill Maher show and other kinds of very, very highly visible platforms, it upsets me. But the fact that some of us have also, some people who claim to be all about working peoples and all these other grassroots issues have also become so-called puppeteers is an issue.
Yeah, sorry, I did not to interject, but you mentioned John McWhorter, and I actually read his latest book, and I read it knowing that it was likely going to make me uncomfortable, but I've really been seeking to, in good faith, understand where people I disagree with are coming from and what their arguments really are. And I'm happy I read his book, because I do think he makes a cogent point. I think he makes an interesting point that I myself am now far more cognizant of in the way that I cover certain stories, because the way that the Black community is talked about and covered in the media is so disempowering and patronizing toward Black Americans. And I didn't even realize how patronizing it is and how disempowering it is. And so that's really the point that he's trying to make. And I think that there's a lot of truth to what he's saying, especially when you look at specific examples of public schools, for instance. The Culver public school system, Culver City public school system here in Los Angeles, has decided to do away with their honor roll classes because they didn't have enough Latino students enrolling in them. And I think that's no, you don't just lower standards. You expect excellence from students that I know without a shadow of a doubt have excellence within them and can rise to the occasion. They need to feel that the adults in the room believe in them and want to help them rise to the occasion. You get what I'm saying? And so that's really the heart of what he made, at least in that book. I can't really speak to the entirety of John McWhorter's work, but the reason why I bring that up and the reason why I respond to you bringing up John McWhorter is because even among those we tend to disagree with, sometimes there are really good points made that we should be open to, receptive to, that we should analyze and really think about. And again, it's so hard to do. I totally get how difficult that is. And reading his book, there were moments where I reflected on my work. I couldn't help but cringe at some of the things I had said in the past, because it kind of took a mirror to my reporting and the work that I've done. And I think that's important. I think it's self-accountability is important. And again, that's not to say that John McWhorter is right about everything, but there are some perspectives that we should consider.
Thank you for saying that. And also, I think it's an example of exactly what you're saying, which is what actually is being lost is empathetic behavior. And we're like using the bait of language rather than actually listening to the ideas that one another have. And it's so important for us to have a media, it's kind of a tech term, but ecosystem where we're all able to talk with one another, the listening practice, the deep listening practice. Look, some folks connected to Black Lives Matter may have said may not be on the surface literally great ways of describing some phenomenon, but we look behind that at what, like, the pain and the suffering and what my colleague Judith Butler calls a listening practice. I think that's so important. So we were just speaking about kind of the patronizing ways identities are being objectified, with this example from the Culver School District or others. And one thing that our President Biden said when he was on the Breakfast Club when he was running in the Democratic primary. I believe it was during the primary, not during the general, but I could be wrong with that. He said, "Hey, if you don't vote for me, you're not black." I look. The president says things clumsily, and maybe that's not exactly what he meant, and so on. But there's something quite out of touch expressed in comments like that. Obviously, I would say that's quite insulting on its surface to other
Yes.
incredible living beings who have intelligence and thoughts and minds and spirits, like all of us.
I mean, there's something sick about
Yeah,
an old white guy serving as thinking of himself as the arbiter of who is and is not black enough. There's just something sick about that, really. And it touches on, or provides, I think, a prime example of how much the Democratic Party, the Democratic establishment, has come to feel entitled to the black vote, to the Latino vote, to traditionally a voter base that has supported them, but increasingly feels is not being represented by the Democratic Party. And so they've taken these voters for granted, election cycle after election cycle. Look, it's devastating, but there is a reason why Donald Trump managed to increase his support among Black and Hispanic voters. And it's because of the fact that, Democrats keep making all these promises and then they don't follow through. Remember, there were 2 Senate runoff elections in 2020 in Georgia. And you have Black voters in the state of Georgia working so hard to get those 2 Democratic senators elected. And the promise was that there was going to be the passage of a new voting rights bill to protect. Yeah, exactly. And Biden didn't even try. They didn't even try. They didn't even fight for it. So how many times does the Democratic establishment think that they can fail to follow through on their promises after their voters put in hard work to get them elected and then not suffer political consequences for that?
like getting ghosted again and again and again, right? It's like
Right.
that experience. And so, now we're at this place where, younger peoples, certainly people who identify as progressive, are very unhappy with the basically arming, if not kind of active participation by the United States government and our military, noting that over 50% of our taxes do go, at least directly or indirectly, to the military budget, which actually goes to private corporations that are contractors who were literally paying our taxes to create weapons and surveillance systems. Big tech companies get tons of money from this so-called military budget. So it's sort of like we're seeing younger people, we're seeing progressive saying like, we're not into this Biden presidency. We see a lot of the mainstream media voice concern about his age and his capacity to get through this election cycle, defeat a vigorous adversary in Donald Trump if he doesn't get locked up, which I don't know. We see the emergence of this sort of strange hybrid candidate who is sort of a shapeshifter in RFK. Mm-hmm. We see Green Party and Cornel West and Cenk kind of contest in the Democratic Party, Cenk Uygur and Marianne Williamson. Where do you see this going as the election comes? I'm not asking you to prognosticate it, but I'm just curious how you're seeing this landscape emerge and play out.
I mean, I see this upcoming presidential election being won by Donald Trump. It's that simple. Poll after poll shows that Trump is leading. I mean, the New York Times Siena College poll indicating that Trump is leading Biden in key battleground states is incredible. It's incredible to me that on one hand, you have the Democratic Party constantly fear-mongering about the threat that Donald Trump poses to our democratic process, while simultaneously insisting on having Biden run for a second term, something he promised not to do when he was running for his first term. If you really think that Trump is a threat to our democratic process, then you would want to run the absolute best candidate to beat him. Biden ain't that guy. And in fact, Biden insists on providing cover for Israel as it engages in ethnic cleansing in the Gaza Strip, which has done what to Biden electorally? It has completely turned the Arab American community against Joe Biden, including in Michigan, a key battleground state. I mean, it is amazing how far our politicians are willing to go, even to spite themselves, in order to provide cover for whatever Israel wants to do, regardless of how far right the government of Israel is. Like, it is amazing to me. It really is. But that's where I see things going. And I think that Joe Biden is just disgustingly selfish. He's a narcissist, an egomaniac who would rather sell out the future of the American people just to get another shot at a second term, just so his legacy looks a little better in his mind. But I would venture to say that he hasn't even considered what his legacy would look like if and when he loses. But he's willing to take that risk because he's a narcissist, and it's disgusting.
It seems like the main talking point that the DNC is putting out, which is, is not even having a fair or open set of primaries where someone like Marianne Williamson could actually be in, or Cenk could actually be in dialogue with Biden, is that the only talking point I see circulating is that Trump is an existential threat, whatever that means.
Well, then they need to act like it. They should act like it. They're not acting like it.
And what about RFK? I mean, who's now getting a lot of support, especially once he decided to go outside of the Democratic Party, because his views didn't seem very, at least progressive, in my opinion.
No, I've got no interest in RFK. He doesn't look. There is a reason why his running as an independent, as opposed to a Democrat, has ended up pulling votes away from Trump instead of Biden. There's a reason why. And so I personally wouldn't feel represented by RFK Jr. I certainly wouldn't feel represented by a second Trump presidency. And I haven't felt represented by Joe Biden. He is so incredibly defiant in his support for the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in Gaza. It's disgusting. And I've said this on the show. People can't stand when I say this. I don't really care. Okay. I get what's on the other side with Trump. I get it. But regardless of that, I cannot morally support Joe Biden after he has greenlit the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. I cannot do that as an Armenian American who comes from a people who were also ethnically cleansed and suffered a genocide. I can't do it. It disgusts me to even consider it. And if the argument is, well, it's not like Trump is any better. I don't know. I really don't know. One thing I do know about Trump is he seems to actually care about what his supporters want. And there's a growing movement within the conservative voting base, which I can't even believe I'm saying, against, U.S. involvement in what's happening with Israel.
Yeah.
Some of it is isolationism, which I don't really fall in the category of, but some of it is also absolute disgust over the images that they're seeing of children being massacred. There actually are, conservatives who are genuine and sincere in wanting to be pro-life. And so they're not hypocrites. If they genuinely see themselves as pro-life figures in the United States, they're pro-life when it comes to what's happening to Palestinian children as well. So I don't know what Trump would do. I do know what Biden's doing, and Biden is just falling into the default position of supporting the Israeli government, regardless of what they're carrying out and regardless of how far right their government happens to be.
It's a really interesting thing I see all around the world. The United States is a very, very complex nation with lots of different voices, lots of different kinds of communities. And as you at the Young Turks, you all at the Young Turks and others have pointed out, actually, generally speaking, if you polled the American public on various issues, and those were the things we actually implemented, it would be a so-called progressive agenda. It may not be that everything that some people who identify as progressives occur, but that's life, right? Like, we live in a polity where we have to come together around issues. Yet somehow our politicians don't seem to reflect those viewpoints at all. And, some folks like Dr. Cornel West, who I personally have a lot of affection for, has said we either get civil war or World War III, which is a bit of a very inflammatory way of putting it, or sensationalist way of putting it. But at the same time, it's sort of like, why are our politicians why do we have such poor options when it comes to this election, given that our country actually is so much more and so much better than these folks?
I just really do think the system incentivizes the worst people to run for office. And I say that because running for public office is very expensive. So, when it comes to the haves and have-nots, obviously the have-nots are discouraged, rightfully so, because of the cost of running for office in running. And I don't say rightfully so because I agree with the system. I think the system needs to be dismantled. I think we need to take money out of politics. We need to make illegal members of Congress trading individual stocks. And we need to create a political system that is much more friendly to people who are not privileged, who are not wealthy, who actually want to serve as public servants, to be able to do so. And we just don't have that system right now. And as a result, you look at the political landscape and the quality of politicians out there. And, who would replace Biden in running for the 2024 presidential election? The names I've heard are Gavin Newsom, disaster, absolute unmitigated disaster for a number of different reasons. But please, if the audience is at all, curious, check out the reporting that I did about how he handled, the campfire in California that happened in 2018, and how he provided cover for the utility company that started that fire and destroyed so many lives, started many fires, PG&E. I mean, Gavin Newsom is in bed with them, has provided cover for them, has bailed them out. Absolutely disgusting. They're still victims of that campfire in California, living in tents on their property because they still haven't gotten the compensation for what PG&E did to them in their lives. And Gavin Newsom made that possible. He's disgusting. So yeah, I just think that our system does not incentivize the right people to run for public office, and we're going to keep running into this issue until we reform the way our system works. And that doesn't mean dismantling our institutions. That means looking at the flaws within the system and fixing those flaws, namely money in politics and the ability for members of Congress to trade individual stocks. I think that's like the heart of a lot of our issues.
Amazing. This podcast is called Utopias, not because we're necessarily believe that utopias are real, but it's what I'm getting at with the name of the podcast is what kind of world or nation or planet do we aspire toward, and how do we start to get there? And that's really why the podcast is called what it is. What's the kind of world that you wish for us to get more toward, including with respect to journalism, and how do we even start to get there? And you've already given us so much around this question. So.
The ideal society that I would see, certainly in the United States, would be a 1950s style economic system that was very much influenced by FDR's policies and the New Deal, with progressive social policies that really uplift people and drive the country toward equality, where all people, regardless of their background, regardless of their race, their ethnicity, are treated with dignity, with respect, and as fellow Americans. I so deeply want to feel pride in my country, feel connection with the people in this country, regardless of what their political persuasions are. And I want to go back to a time, and I do think this existed to some extent, go back to a time when Americans deeply cared about and respected each other, regardless of who they voted for and which party they supported. Things have gotten so polarized, so hateful, so angry. And I know that I have no control over the actions of others or the behavior of others. But over the last, I would say, year and a half, 2 years, I've really taken stock of my own behavior and thought of ways to just reform myself and the way that I treat others as an example of how I'd like to see people behave in our political landscape and just within interpersonal relations among voters.
Your humility and integrity, and I would even say vulnerability, is so refreshing, and it's something I've known or I've seen in you, like in the decade plus that we've known one another, Anna. And I just wanted to express my deepest thanks and gratitude for your joining us. And here's to continuing to build together. And I'm always here to support you any way I can.
Ramesh, I feel the exact same way about you. You're just such a kind spirit, kind soul. And I'm very grateful to not only do your podcast, but to, get to know you as a friend and have you in my life. It's been a real treasure. So thank you.
The Utopias podcast with Professor Ramesh Srinivasan is produced and edited by me, Phoebe Browse. You can access episodes on all streaming platforms. And if you have questions or comments, please email podcastutopias@gmail.com. That's podcastutopias@gmail.com. See you all next time.